Hello, and welcome once again to this webinar series from the Prairie Organic Development Fund on the topic of value-added processing. If you're joining for the first time, this is the second video in the series. The first module gave an overview of some of the considerations that might help you to make a decision about adding on-farm processing to your existing grain farm. And the first module was perhaps a little bit more conceptual, exploring some of the questions that would be influenced by your own farm situation. Exploring your own goals and values around adding a new farm endeavor. The second video will dive into some of the nitty-gritty details, and there are a lot of details when it comes to grain and food processing. So we'll be looking at regulations around building and infrastructure, equipment, co-packing, growing and sourcing grain inputs, quality control, primary and secondary packaging, along with CFIA labeling requirements and UPC codes, touching on insurance and some regulatory considerations, different options you may have for distribution, pricing your product for retail, budgeting, looking at capital and overhead expenses versus your cost of goods sold, how to review your financial health, which is probably a good idea sometimes, and then some topics related to hiring, training, and retaining staff. This material is intended for you if you are a grain farmer and you're looking into adding value to your crops and doing some further processing on your grain. Welcome here. The first topic that we're going to look at is the physical infrastructure that you will be needing for starting a food processing business, specifically looking at the inventory that you have around your own farm and some of the infrastructure that you may already have in place. Those decisions around whether to build or to renovate will need to be made at the beginning of your food processing endeavor and will have long-reaching implications for your business growth. When we started out our own milling operation, we were carrying orders of 6 and 12 packages out of the mill by hand and loading them into the trunk of our Volkswagen car. So when a sale on tile flooring was too good to pass up, we tiled the entrance and the packaging room without really thinking about the small step in between the two rooms. Within a few years, we were kicking ourselves for not leveling off the floor before tiling, because that step was now making it impossible to move orders around on pallets and forklifts. So we have to carry product out onto our production floor before palletizing. It seemed like a really small detail at the time, but over the course of a year, it now means that hundreds of thousands of pounds are being carried by hand when a pallet jack could have saved us huge amounts of work. So planning for growth, even when that growth is a long way off or even seems impossible, can be really important. I included 2 screenshots from the game Egg Inc. It's pretty satisfying to play. Just a click of a button can upgrade your loading dock. Instead of loading semis with a forklift, you're packing your eggs into a rocket ship with a conveyor system. Unfortunately, of course, it's not that simple on your own farm, so the decisions that you make very early on will be difficult to change. So with grain processing, there's the inspectors who come and take a look at your facility will be categorizing your operations into several different risk categories. The lowest risk category includes grains that are going to be cooked by the end user or during secondary manufacturing. So this would include any type of flour that's being milled that will then be, baked into bread. Most grains are cooked again once by the end user. Also, processing that does not require the use of water would be in the lowest risk category. So the requirements, and this is in general, kind of in between the different prairie provinces, they're mostly similar, but there are very small differences between them. So the general requirements for low risk processing are that your building is simply of sound construction, the roof isn't caving in, things aren't collapsing, that the window and door openings are sealed, there's not gaps in the windows or the doors, that the floor and the walls are washable and they have coving connecting the two, and that your lights are shatterproof. And that can be as simple as just replacing your bulbs with a plastic coated shatterproof bulb. However, if your grain processing fits into the higher risk category, there are different requirements. And so a higher risk category might be if you're steaming or washing and then drying a grain. And so those higher risk categories might require that your facility has a poured seamless floor, stainless steel wall coverings, ventilation and exhaust systems, potable water and or wastewater treatment systems. And so certainly think about the processing that you're intending to start and look into the future. If you ended up changing or adding a steaming operation to your grain processing, what would upgrades and retrofits look like? Would that be possible? And so those are sometimes almost impossible questions to ask, but it's certainly, or impossible to answer, but they're certainly worth asking. Another consideration specific to farms is that there are regulations around spaces used for food processing that are attached or adjacent to a private dwelling. So for example, if you have a washroom facility for the staff to use, it may be possible to have shared washroom facilities with your own home, and that may be at the discretion of the health inspector. Again, using some type of facility that's next to a private dwelling may also be possible, but they will need to be distinctly separate areas with walls or closed doors in between those spaces. But the degree of separation, again, can be a little bit of a judgment call that can be discussed with your health inspector. As you're planning out your facility, it'll be very helpful. It'll be required by your inspectors and also helpful for you to make a map of your facility, including what the proposed processing areas are going to be, the equipment, traffic flow, pest control methods, storage areas, and your washroom or staff areas. And certainly include in that any type of farm-related hazards or contaminants that might impact your facility. So some questions around whether or not there's animals that are on your farm as well. You may have some portion of your operation that includes livestock. Other considerations might be hay yards. Is a hay yard in close proximity? And if so, it may make it very difficult to keep your processing space rodent-free. Once again, I implore you to reach out to your provincial health inspectors to come down to your site and make recommendations before you begin any of your construction or renovation. They may offer really, really helpful suggestions specific to your farm context that may change a lot of the decisions that you make early on. So I've also included some links. So there are some resources from each of the prairie provinces on the different regulations for setting up your food processing facility. So look for the resource page along with the video in order to access those links. If you're not finding it, simply looking for health inspection for the province that you're in, and food processing facilities. Each province does have requirements around the facility itself and those different requirements. When you're looking at designing or retrofitting some of the physical infrastructure that you'll need for your processing, keep in mind that you will be needing to meet the requirements of 4 different regulatory bodies. So there's the provincial health regulations, which set up the details for the inside of the building, the floors and the walls and the doors and these types of things. And then there is also the provincial building codes, which do have often different categories for farm buildings versus commercial buildings. So you may find that there would be upgrades or changes needed if you're retrofitting one of the farm buildings that you may already have. Keep in mind some of the municipal zoning restrictions and whether or not your specific RM has regulations for what type of industries or activities can take place in each area. And then the final place to be looking for is the Office of the Fire Commissioner. There are certainly fire risks associated with grain dust, so ventilation and dust reduction are extremely important. And you also may already be familiar with some of the requirements for grain drying, but if you're looking at adding grain drying as a new component of your operations, if you don't already do this on your farm, then reaching out to the Office of the Fire Commissioner for the regulations and the requirements that they have for grain drying is also extremely important. Somehow I couldn't figure out how to get rid of myself on this slide because there's no room, so I'm making myself teeny tiny. Sorry for the technological bump. Now with design considerations, of course, every farm is unique. And I'll just pose some questions that might help to guide some of your decision making. Of course, milling wheat for flour is very, very different than than turning barley into beer. So these physical infrastructure considerations, of course, will vary widely with your farm and with your product. Of course, the first thing that people want to know is how much space do you actually need. It would be very hard to put a number on it, but I'm going to anyways. I would say a 2,500 square foot facility might be reasonable depending on what you're processing. If you're starting out with something fairly simple, you're seed cleaning or milling, and a fairly simple range of products, that could be a good starting spot. Less maybe could be possible if you're doing something very, very limited. And of course, more is always better. You'll never be sad about having a little bit of extra dancing room. For electrical capacity, most farms will be running just on single phase, but a lot of the processing equipment will run on three-phase power. If you have the option of bringing in three-phase power, that could potentially help along the way and help to reduce the cost and some of the retrofits needed on the equipment that you will need to be purchasing. But most machinery, again, can be rewired and purchased with a single-phase motor. But that is certainly a consideration you'll want to look at and matching those up. I've already talked about this already in the previous slide, but is water or plumbing needed in your mill facility? With cleaning, most of the cleaning operations would take place simply with vacuuming or using an air compressor to dust off equipment. But there might be some situations where water is necessary in order to clean or to flush out equipment. Again, with hand washing as well for employees who are doing packaging, it may be possible to simply have hand sanitizer stations set up. So you may not need hand wash stations for your employees, and that would be on a case-by-case basis. Of course, dust control and ventilation is always very important, not only for making a safe building that's not going to be a risk of fires, and also just for the health and safety of those people who are working in the facility. Having airborne dust contaminants is going to make it a much more difficult workplace. So if some of those considerations can be met early on, and some things, even just the ceiling height to mitigate the quantity of dust in your airspace can be helpful, but ventilation or dust control in the building itself may be necessary as well. Moving on to the middle row here, your shipping and receiving infrastructure. Hopefully some of these will able to be met with the infrastructure that you already have on your farm. The grain bins and the augers or the conveyors that you already have for moving your harvested grain. But then how will that be conveyed into your building? Will you be moving everything into totes, or will you have an auger system or a conveyor system to move your grain into your processing facility? And there's no right answer for that. Certainly augers and conveyors have done very well, worked really well in our own process, but there's also certain circumstances where we'll move product by tote instead. Again, for the outgoing product, so considering things like what are the size of your loading doors? Can they accommodate pallets and moving equipment in and out of your building? Do you have infrastructure for semi-trucks to come into your farmyard? Do you have the ability to load product onto larger trucks? And what is the dock height if you do have a loading dock? Traffic flow, and this would be not just for products but also for your employees. Is it a logical way for them to enter into the facility? And how about visitors? Are they also able to come into the facility? Perhaps you have a shop set up on the farm. Is that integrated with your processing facility in a way that will prevent contamination of product that's being processed? So looking at traffic flow for visitors, for employees, and for your products as well, and having different paths so that they travel around your facility without contaminating each other. Food defense is the category of limiting the possibility of external tampering. So this would be someone coming onto your property with the intention of sabotage, getting into your grain bins or getting into the product. And so are there some types of defense mechanisms that you have in place? This can be, on kind of the simpler level, just having a residence on site where the yard is being monitored by the people who live there, having good yard lighting, or possibly a security system on the facility as well. For storage, this goes from, again, the grain post-harvest, different food inputs that you might get. And one of the areas that I drastically underestimated was the storage requirements for packaging material. Each product that we mill, we buy packaging for in batches of 20,000, as that's generally the minimum print run. And at the moment we have 8 different products. And so we have pallet loads and some pallet racking just holding boxes of packages. Because if we purchase packages for 20,000, that will be a few years worth of packages on hand for particular products. So a lot of our space is getting used up with just storing packaging material, and then also the secondary packaging, the boxes and totes that are used for carrying the retail products after they've been packaged. Screenings, this kind of fits into the traffic flow as well. So do you have a system or a process for moving screenings out of the building? So if you're doing grain cleaning, this will be the extraneous material, the weeds and the chaff and the dust. Some of it may be conveyed by air if you're looking at moving out dust and chaff. You might have screenings by products that would be able to be used for livestock feed. Do you have a way of storing those and conveying them out of your building? Is it going to be stored in totes or into smaller bags? And then are they stored on site or are they moved out directly? And coming up with a flow pattern to make sure that your screenings are not going to be cross-contaminating your incoming product. Of course, you always want to consider space for growth, product expansion, and reconfigurations. So if things fit just right the way they are, it's probably not going to work for very long. Again, your level of integration with farm operations is one of those big questions we looked at earlier. If you can share infrastructure like grain bins and tractors, that will certainly help to get you started, but may cause complications along the way, especially with long-term planning. Is it possible that the farm and the processing business will part ways at some point? How does that fit into future growth or even succession or sale of the business or of the farm? And so these are some questions that you can be considering as you're starting out on that journey. Moving on to the equipment that you might need for your processing. The first question I think that's important to pose is whether or not your equipment will be stationary or movable. And this might seem somewhat unimportant, but it will impact a few things along the road. Certainly with the design of your building and also with the types of equipment that you purchase itself. Some equipment will need to be anchored to the floor, so this is a gravity table or some of the sifters needed or additional equipment will need to be anchored. So looking at the flooring of your building and whether or not that can accommodate bolts anchoring your equipment down to the concrete. And there was certainly some advantages to having each thing in its place. With the augers that you're able to use, you may be able to move to a vacuum conveyance system with the ducting system in place. But having equipment that isn't stationary gives you the opportunity to adapt and change. One grain might be better suited to be sent through the gravity table before or after the screen cleaner. And this will kind of vary sometimes lot by lot and batch to batch, and certainly each individual crop will vary as well. So having some of your equipment stacked on top of each other, having some of your equipment stationary and some of it movable to be able to accommodate different flow patterns of the grain itself may all be important. So we put all of our equipment on casters and it can be moved around our facility. And then in some places that puts us into trouble. And so it would be nice to have things a little bit more stationary when we look at our conveyance systems and the augers that we have in place. So your product could be moved via totes. So the 2,000-pound mini totes can be used to move product from one machine to the next. Using the augers like the flex augers. There's also the chain conveyor systems that are becoming more common and can work really well for gentle handling of your grain. And then a vacuum system, which would again have use suction to be able to move your product from one machine to the other. Some of the seed cleaning equipment that you might be using on your line if you're cleaning your own seed, cleaning your own product. These might start with a grater used to make kind of a rough sort between different sizes of product. Screen cleaners, again, to clean out some of the weeds and different extraneous matter that might be in your crop. Indent cleaners to separate by length. Gravity tables to separate out lighter and denser materials. Destoners may also fit into that category. And aspirators to take out chaff and dust. Some of those equipment are going to be fairly readily available in the used market or locally through auctions, Kijiji, or even just your local equipment dealers. Some of the more basic equipment will be more readily available, which is certainly an advantage starting out. They're a little bit easier to find and also easier to flip when you've decided that that one doesn't quite suit your needs as much as you thought it would. You may find out that you have a bit of a revolving door of equipment as you test out different processes and different pieces of equipment. And certainly upgrading one piece of equipment has a trickle-down effect on everything else in your line. A newer or a bigger screen cleaner might have a less efficient fan, and you might need to add aspiration before sending your product through something like an optical sorter, which can be bogged down if the grain is too dusty. And so keeping that in mind, that the ability to liquidate and to change your equipment may be important. And this gets more and more difficult with the more specialized processing equipment that you might need. So heat processing, steaming, or micronizing your grain. Flour mills, depending on the specs, might be more difficult to find as well. Packaging machinery for weighing and sealing packages. And then again, anything specific to your own process, whether you're mixing and roasting granola or brewing something, those will certainly be much more difficult to find, certainly more difficult to find locally or in used condition. And so if you have a revolving door of new equipment that you've gone to great lengths to find, that's going to leave you in a rough spot. Considering the capacity and the speed of each machine will also be important. Of course, we always want to have additional capacity to be able to grow in the future, but some equipment may only operate properly at full capacity. So matching the scale of each piece of equipment can help to ensure that your product quality is as good as it can be. For some equipment, using a surge hopper in between your augers in the beginning of a machine can help to moderate this. So if you have one piece of equipment that's much faster, you can use a surge hopper to collect product from the previous piece of equipment to make sure that the next piece is operating at full capacity. And in some cases, having a slow trickle through might give you really great cleaning quality or milling quality. With each piece of equipment, you also need to be considering what the cleaning and maintenance procedures are. And so is it something that needs to be calibrated or cleaned, daily, weekly, monthly, or yearly? And what does that process look like? Certainly with augers, this is another consideration as well. Things like a vacuum conveyance system will be very easy to flush out between one batch to the other, where with flex augers, you might need to run a lot of product through before you're able to get rid of the contaminants from the previous batch. So if you're switching from one product to the other, that can be fairly important to consider what the clean out procedure is for each piece of equipment. And considering the salability of equipment as well, which can be really difficult if you're flipping a lot of equipment, but also consider that equipment that's difficult to find and may be hard to liquidate, but it often doesn't depreciate much in value either. So you might buy a piece of equipment and be able to hang on to it and use it for 20 years and sell it for a price fairly similar to what you purchased it for, because everyone else is in the same situation, and some of this equipment is fairly difficult to find. And once you find it, if you treat it well, it will treat you well in the end as well. So fairly early on in your planning, after you've looked at some of the facility and equipment requirements that you may have, one option that you will want to consider would be using a co-packer to help complete one or several of the components of your processing. So a co-packer is simply an opportunity for sharing facilities or production with a similar processing business, or with someone who's set up specifically just for packaging multiple products. So this might be available for part of your processing, something like the seed cleaning that would take place before milling, or for one of the processes involved, looking at either roasting or steaming one of your products, and fairly commonly for packaging the end product. If you choose to outsource some of the equipment or the labor involved in producing your end product, reaching out to a co-packer early on will be extremely valuable. You may find that a co-packer is only outfitted to work with a certain packaging material or a certain size, or you might find that there are certain restrictions with the type of ingredients that they can or can't work with, specifically with products that may have gluten or other allergies like sesame or soy. You may also find that once your product is at a co-packers, adding one additional step may not be much more expensive, whereas purchasing that piece of equipment on your own might be prohibitive. So this might change the type of equipment that you end up purchasing on your own. In the industrial food system, we've achieved very low food prices through maximizing efficiency and scale. So as a new company starting up with really small volumes, it can be difficult to match the pricing of larger brands. Co-packing can help create some of these efficiencies by working collaboratively with similar processors. This can be, some co-packers will even have packaging material that's been purchased in larger quantities by the hundreds of thousands rather than by several thousand at a time. And then you're just adding a print or a sticker label to a portion of that package, which will certainly decrease your price per piece. So co-packing can help you to fill some of the gaps, whether that's infrastructure and equipment, with expertise and labor for packaging. And this can be a short-term, just as you're getting started, or it can be a long-term strategy that you may never have the intention to complete one of the processes on your own. And if there's a co-packer in your area that has a good match with your production, that can be a great way to collaborate with another business to be able to maximize your efficiency. Just consider asking lots of questions before you start out with that endeavor. So what are their production schedules? What's the lead time on sending a batch through? Do they have minimum and maximum production runs? What kind of packaging materials and sizes can they accommodate? So these are all questions that will need to be fairly important to look at before choosing if or who to be co-packing with. So there's a list of resources as well. There's some really great co-packer directories and some resources out there to help you to find a co-packer in your area. If you've been looking at the equipment and design considerations and looking to outsource some of those jobs. So on the topic of outsourcing, another question that you may face is whether or not it's a good idea for you to be growing your own grain inputs. This might seem silly considering the topic of these modules, adding processing to the farm that you already have, but somewhere down the road, it will likely become important to question whether or not you should be growing your own inputs. So there could be a good case made for starting a processing endeavor and ditching the farm altogether. So you might as well consider that right from the start. So some of the advantages of growing your own grain inputs is that using your own farm products can offer some pricing advantages and it can reduce some of your upfront inventory costs. Now, I would suggest that you shouldn't be shortchanging yourself. Don't use your farm as a way of making your processing facility seem more profitable than it actually is. You need to be paying yourself or your farm for the inputs that you're using, but it still offers the advantage that you're not paying for it in cash up front. You're paying for it with the labor calculations that you're making and your machinery repair bills that come in at the end of the season, but you're not transacting cash for the grain bin of crop that you would otherwise be purchasing. Growing your own grain can also be a significant marketing strategy. Consumers and buyers like to hear the full story and have full traceability of where their grain came from. So being able to tell the story of how a particular crop was planted and tended and harvested can be part of the story that you're telling to your customers. and that can give you certainly a marketing edge over some of your competitors and help to differentiate your product from other larger brands. Growing your own grain can also help to moderate some of the uncertainties of market fluctuations. So you might find that your product inventory is getting low and you're stuck buying at a price that's much higher than what you had calculated. And you may not be able to change your product price to match those the changing input costs. So if you're using a product that fluctuates really widely on the grain market, then there certainly is an advantage of being able to moderate out some of those uncertainties. If you're growing your own grains, you can also modify and adapt to which varieties you're growing. Growing crops and varieties with certain attributes that might be helpful to your specific processing needs, which might be different than other people. So it might not be an attribute that other people value and might be difficult to find on the market. You might want to be harvesting just a touch higher moisture than you would commonly be able to purchase, and that might actually really significantly impact some of your processing. Of course, you might want to grow your own grains because you just don't have a choice. Farming's a bit addicting and it's pretty hard to stop. So, but I will, I'll be logical and level-headed, and we'll move over to some of the disadvantages. It can be certainly difficult in poor weather years to use the crop that you've harvested, and it can be a bit of a tricky line between rejecting your own crop. If you've harvested something and the quality or the specs are a little bit borderline, you might end up using a crop that's far more difficult to use or to process or to mill, and then developing alternative markets for off-grade crops can be difficult as well. So sometimes you'll end up using a product that you never would have purchased because the quality isn't what you don't want it to be. The flip side of not having to buy product at high pricing is that you also can't chase low market pricing. You'll always be buying your own crop from yourself at a moderate and reasonable price. Also, another factor is that increasing production, if you find that there's really strong demand for the product that you're producing, increasing the production might take 2 or more years of crop and rotation planning. It might even mean purchasing more land to be able to match that capacity. We mill at a very small scale on our own farm, and there's certainly been times when we've been approached by buyers looking for for truckload and shipping container load quantities that that would be really beneficial for us to be able to take advantage of. But scaling up to that to be able to meet that new buyer, isn't something that's possible within 1 year's production. Growing your own crop also leaves you vulnerable to crop failure. Farm insurance isn't going to help to keep your product on a restaurant's menu. And once you've done a lot of work, months and sometimes years of work to get your product onto a store shelf or into a certain restaurant, if you have to pull that product because you had a crop failure, that could be devastating. And again, you will have to develop alternative markets for your off-grade crops, for bumper crop quantities, and potentially alternative sources that you may be able to access for crop disaster situations. And although there may not be an either-or situation, it may be possible to consider buying from other producers as part of your production plan. So you might be growing some of your grain inputs and sourcing some of your grain inputs to be able to kind of moderate and balance out some of these advantages and disadvantages. So even if you are growing all of your own grains and you've decided to go the route of keeping things as local as possible, depending on the final product that you're making, you're likely going to have to be developing some input and supplier criteria for purchasing additional ingredients. Whether you're making a cereal product that combines your own grains with maybe nuts, fruits, or spices, or a pancake mix using homegrown flour from your own farm, it's a little bit trickier to come by products like baking powder. So you're going to have to be developing criteria for sourcing out these additional products. Of course, the funnest and one of the easiest places to look for is other local suppliers. And this can be anything from a neighbor that has a product that would work well with your own grains, or just looking to your own local community for what type of products are most interesting and unique to your area. So this can be a really fun process, trying to work with other farmers or other suppliers, but there is also a balancing act with that as well. You might find that there's, in Manitoba here, the berry of choice would certainly be a Saskatoon berry if I were to look for something to add to a granola product. But I know that if I've chosen something unique like a Saskatoon berry, if the one farm that has a dried organic Saskatoon no longer is able to supply in the capacity or the volume that I need, that certainly creates dependencies and can be really risky. So there is certainly marketing benefits when you find that one perfect product to blend with your own ingredients. But if there's not alternatives and backups and additional suppliers possible, that's certainly putting yourself into a risky situation as well. So it is a balance between local and unique, and also attainable and consistent. If you're using additional food products, additional inputs to create food products that are organic certified, of course, you need to be getting supplier approvals, tracking affidavits, as well as the organic certification from each of those suppliers. In that process, it'll likely also be helpful for you to develop your own supplier approval form, tracking some of the research that you've done and the criteria that you have set in selecting a certain product. You didn't just pull something out of the air, you chose that product for reasons. And so if you systematize and record some of that rationale, that will certainly come in handy for any additional audits that you might have. That might be from your organic certifier, or for a food safety certification like HACCP, if you're looking to get an allergen-free certification or kosher. And certainly in some type of a recall situation, if there is a food safety concern that could potentially have derived from one of those inputs, the more you systematize and record your decision-making procedures, and even just the traceability and receiving systems, those will certainly serve you well. In addition to things like allergens and organic, look for where you want to be sourcing out your product. Is there a minimum shelf life? Is it going to decrease the shelf life of your own product, adding something that has a lower shelf life? What's the lead time on orders? Certainly through the period of COVID, we found that any type of products that we were getting locally were readily available, and it was very easy to get the things that were produced locally. We had packaging, however, coming from a Chinese distributor supplier, and those packages were 4 to 8 months longer in lead time than what we were anticipating. So certainly the closer to home some of your suppliers are, that can give you some advantages. Or if the product is stuck at a shipping port across the ocean, you can't just drive down in your farm truck and solve the problem on your own. Of course, you'll also have to be balancing with so many of your business decisions, balancing the cost of purchasing higher volumes. Sometimes you'll be able to get a lower price per pound by purchasing in higher quantities. But that, of course, comes with risks of carrying more inventory that may become stale dated or not usable, or simply reduces the cash that you have available. And so that's always a balance as well. Trying to anticipate what your own volume will be, how much product to be purchasing, and then that impacts, of course, your pricing as well. So you may be able to offer your product at a lower cost if you're able to get higher volumes from some of your suppliers. So these are just some of the considerations to be looking at quite quickly. Again, these are not specific to grain farming, so you'll find probably much better resources and information for some of these criteria, looking just for food processing information more generally. But as a grain farmer, this is something to just to be aware that they are some factors that you'll need to be considering on that input side of things. As you get into the detail of your operations and your product flow, you're going to find that likely early on, things change rapidly, and systems that you thought would work will often be replaced with new equipment and altered processes. There's no rule book for milling or for grain cleaning, and usually it's a matter of trial and error until you get things right. So this means in turn that there's likely going to be a period of time maybe weeks, maybe months, maybe years, where your product might not meet the high quality that you were hoping for, or that meeting that high quality is ridiculously inefficient. This is going to be an important topic with quality control. I remember waiting over 6 months for a machine that we had ordered to arrive. All the while, as we were waiting for this machine that we knew we needed to get our quality up to the standards that we wanted to, we were hand sorting our oats. Every little kernel of oats we were evaluating and assessing and getting to know them quite intimately. So of course we dreaded every order that we received, because every package of product we sent out the door took at least 10 times longer than what we had calculated when we set our cost of production. Of course, this isn't unique to grain processing. I'm sure the same is true when a carpenter builds their first set of cabinets, or when any manufacturing business develops a new product. The startup phase can be really difficult to manage, and trying to keep costs even remotely in line can seem impossible. But eventually, as you work your way into a systemized way of operating, it'll be really important to develop a set of quality control parameters that will help you to ensure a consistent and high quality end product. This will also be an important stepping stone if you hire employees to do some or all of your processing, and if you're no longer doing a personal assessment of every individual product that's produced. So the top corner here, the first step along our quality control cycle will be to develop those workflow systems to mitigate and monitor any changes in quality. So this is making sure that you're doing things the same way every time you do your operations, that you have systems that will ensure that that you're not making too many mistakes along the way. So with cleaning grain, this is mitigating and monitoring for the presence of foreign materials, whether this is just weeds or chaff, whether it's stones, metal, weeds, insects, etc., looking for all those impurities and contaminants that you're wanting to remove from the grain. With milling and further processing, this is developing quality parameters. So this might be not things that would cause harm or food safety, drastic problems, but your quality parameters like color, the texture of your milled product, the weight or the bushel weight of your incoming or outgoing product, the appearance for an oat. This is the thickness of each flake and how to measure that, and the consistency from batch to batch. It might be entirely fine to have a product that, an oat flake that's slightly thicker than the next flake, but your customers will value consistency and knowing that they're able to cook the product the same way time to get time. And this may also be trying to keep consistent with your competitor's product, so that when a consumer switches from a larger brand over to your product, that they're able to make that transition seamlessly, that they're not relearning how to cook because you're developing your product slightly differently. Moisture as well is really important with grain. Establishing thresholds for safety and for storage. This is for the grain that you're harvesting or you're receiving, and after it's completed its processing as well. Do you have changes to the moisture level that will change your shelf life? So doing a shelf life analysis of your product and developing a best before date is part of this quality control that will continually cycle back to monitoring your moisture. So generally a food product that has a shelf life of 6 months or greater is considered shelf stable. And so it may be very important to be able to ensure that your product will be stable for at least that long. With grains, that's not usually a problem. Usually grains are shelf stable for much longer than that, but you may want to conduct your own analysis looking at rancidity or oxidization of your product to ensure what is the threshold. Can you recommend that consumers use your product safely for 1 or 2 or 3 years, or potentially longer? And those are things that you can include in the information that you give to your customers, along with their storage recommendations. So once you've got things worked out and you have a system that's ensuring that you have the best quality product all the time, the next step then is to develop written SOPs. So these are your standard operating procedures. So this is writing down and documenting what it is that you do to make sure that your product is the best quality. In addition to explaining what it is that you do with your procedures, you also need to include ways for verifying that you are actually doing those things. So one example might be how often do you give a visual inspection to your product, and then do you record what those are. So you might be doing a random test once a random test from your product flow, and assessing a portion of your product, how often that's done, and then what you're seeing in the results. Documenting those results will be helpful for any future audits or food safety, and certainly for any recall situations. And this is a little bit difficult to develop or to figure out how precise to be. Looking at some of your most important safety measures will be important to document what you're doing to ensure quality for each of those, things like inspecting magnets or looking at moisture would be important to be documenting fairly regularly. But once you have your written SOPs in place, you're not done, and the cycle goes right back to the beginning. There's always going to be changes, batch to batch, year to year, lot to lot. Every time you make an alteration to a piece of equipment or you change the way one thing is calibrated. Quality control is a continual process of evaluating your incoming and your outgoing product, adapting, changing, documenting what you're changing in order to ensure that your food product is safe and the highest quality possible, in order to keep your customers happy and to be able to ensure that that you're doing the best you're able to do with your food product. So once your product is looking just right, the next thing you need is a way to communicate that with their customers and convince them to choose your product instead of every other product out there. Even if you're selling direct to consumer, some kind of packaging material is likely going to be necessary. Scooping up handfuls of grains and dumping them into your customers' pockets probably isn't going to cut it, even at a farmer's market. So we're going to take a look at some of the different factors and considerations with choosing your primary packaging. So the material is probably the first question that you'll ask. Do you want your product packaged in paper, in plastic, in some type of bioplastic, cardboard carton, or glass? And these will certainly influence the cost and the durability and the aesthetics of your product. So for durability, this is a really important consideration. Because your product, particularly selling to retail, takes a little bit of abuse as it goes onto the store shelf, can get picked up by store employees as they're rearranging product, and by consumers as they're turning your product over and reading all the information about it, fall off the shelf. So if you have a plastic product package, this is certainly advantageous because it doesn't matter how crumpled or how many times it drops. It doesn't take much to smooth out the wrinkles, and it looks just as good as new. Where a paper package is much more likely to break or tear or just look crumpled and wrinkled on the shelf. But it cost as well. Certainly plastic has some great advantages with cost. It's definitely the cheapest product to manufacture. But your consumers and yourself might also have other factors in mind. You might highly value something that's compostable or recyclable. Certainly single-use plastics, there's been a lot of consumer demand for having sustainable products for their food products specifically. So it's not just durability and cost that need to be considered as well. Having products that have shelf appeal will help your product to move off the shelf as well. For retail specifically, one of the factors that may be overlooked would be how much shelf-facing size does your product give you. The stand-up pouch, or an SUP, is a pouch with a kind of sealed sides, the edges that come to a point on the sides, where a gusseted bag has 4 sides to it, so it's a cube. Rather the stand-up pouches, which are more of a pouch, I guess. The gusseted bags can be really deceptive. They look like they're a small amount of product. And when customers are walking around a store, they often don't really have time to look at all the details and to read the weight on your product. So whether your product appears bigger or smaller can make all the difference as to whether people give it a moment's consideration. Consider also novelty. Do you want something that looks like your competition's product, or do you want to have something that stands out differently? A cardboard carton, in a sphere might really stand out and grabs people's attention, but might be more costly to manufacture. For retail, you certainly need to have a tamper-proof seal of some sort. So if that's plastic or a bioplastic, that can be a heat-sealed top that gets sealed before it's brought to the store, a sewed bag or a glued carton. These are all ways of making sure that the product hasn't been tampered or touched before the consumer gets to it. The size and the quantity, this is something that you'll need to be calculating with your own cost of production. For the retail market, products, in the $4 to $8 market are usually what you're wanting to see on the store shelf. But that's just a rule of thumb. It's not and we'll talk more about pricing your product for retail as well. But the size of your product will be the first factor in what the end shelf shelf cost will look like. You may also have the exact same product as your competitors, but you know that consumers are looking for a different size, whether it's smaller or larger or different configurations. So that might be something that offers you a market advantage of just offering a size that's different than everyone else. So when you're looking at costs, from what I've seen, generally most of my packages cost about 60 cents per package. And it doesn't really matter whether that package can hold, half a pound of product or 20 pounds of product. It usually comes to about 60 cents. But this will vary with material. So our products have been pre-printed paper, sometimes paper lined with a bioplastic. So you may be able to get your cost down closer to the 20 cent per package range, or up to the dollar, even $1.50 per package range. One of the considerations there is whether you would go with a pre-printed package or with a sticker label on top of a mass manufactured package. So going with a pre-printed label means that you're developing using graphic design software or a graphic designer services to develop what the label will look like on your package. That label then gets sent to the packaging company. They will have a design and graphic design team that makes sure that it fits the right parameters. And then they will be setting up printing plates to be able to print your images directly onto the package. It can be a really, really cost-efficient way to create your packaging. Usually they will only charge between 3 to 10 cents for the printing that goes onto your packaging. So it can be a very cost-efficient way of getting your information onto a package. Whereas a sticker label, it's very easy to have $1 worth of labels sitting on your package, just to be able to communicate the information to your customers, where printing that directly would have only cost you a few cents. The disadvantage, though, with having a pre-printed package is that you're usually looking at minimum print runs of 10 to 20,000 packages at once. So this makes it really costly to start up with a new product that you're not sure how it's going to sell. It can be pretty difficult to have 20,000 packages when you're selling 2 or 3 at a time. The plate charges as well can be significant. Printing the packages will only cost you a few cents each, but developing and printing the plates that will print those will usually cost $100 to $200 per color. So if you have 3 or 4 different colors on your package, you may have $800 of plate charges before you've printed a single package. Where if you're printing sticker labels, that can be on your own home printer and just your own time in changing the label. Last factor to consider is where the origin of your packages are. So this will certainly impact the lead time that you need for each of your orders. Some of our packages that come from just fairly close to us, we can get an order to our door within 2 to 3 weeks of placing an order, even if they're printed on directly. So, however, some of our packages come from further away, and particularly during COVID, we were seeing 8 or 9 months pass between when we placed an order and when we actually received the product. And 6 months is more common for all of our orders, even in non-COVID times. Communication can also be a factor. If your packages are being printed and manufactured further away, there's likely several layers of people in between you and the final processing or the final manufacturing. So your order will likely be communicated through a graphic design team to the packaging company and then to the manufacturing floor. And so there is opportunity for miscommunication along the way. And so the closer to home, sometimes the more you can be ensuring that there's good communication to make sure the packages look the way you want them to in the end. Because it's a difficult one to swallow when you end up with 10,000 packages with the printing on the wrong side or something upside down or backwards or UPC codes that won't scan. So, and finally, looking at food safety, making sure that you're getting packaging from a company that is set up to be supplying food product packages, and they need to have some food safety parameters in place to make sure that there's pest control and and safe inputs being used for their packaging material. So those are some of the criteria looking for your packaging material. Once you've determined your type of packaging, where to source it from, the material that it will be made out of, the dimensions of your package, you'll need to get to work developing a label. Now, this can be really intimidating. There's a lot of elements set by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency that go into what a food label can and cannot look like. There are two basic routes you can take. If you have some computer skills, an idea of what you want your label to look like, and a strong DIY bent, you can dive right in and develop your label yourself. Graphic design software like Adobe Illustrator is available to download or to simply pay a monthly subscription. So for about $40 a month, you can have access to all the design software that every graphic designer would be using. There's also free versions, Inkscape, that can be used to generate your label. I started out this way, downloading Inkscape for free because it took me months and months working at it, and I was on a pretty tight budget, and so developed a label myself. In the end, I found that most packaging companies want an Adobe Illustrator format, so then I had to transfer my Inkscape format over to Adobe Illustrator. But it did work in the end with a little bit of extra elbow grease along the way. The other option, of course, and certainly the most bomb-proof, is working with the graphic designer to develop your label. Look for someone who has worked with food products, and specifically Canadian food products, before, so that they're familiar with the different elements and they can help to catch some of your mistakes. And of course, someone whose style resonates with the feel that you'd like to convey with your product. Don't be afraid to shop around. Look for someone who you enjoy the work that they've done in the past, and you think it would be a good fit for your product. But irregardless of which route you're taking, the DIY version or working with a graphic designer, it's important to be familiar with all the different elements of a label, because at the end of the day, it's your product. If you spend thousands of dollars and print tens of thousands of packages, and it comes back to you and something is incorrect on the label, you've said something about the allergens that's incorrect, you have your nutrition facts at the wrong size or the wrong font, you're the one who's going to be paying for the price for it. And so working with a graphic designer is a fantastic tool, but it doesn't absolve you of responsibility for following all the requirements. So those requirements for food labels are laid out on the Canadian Food Inspection Agency's website, and there's a food labeling tool for industry. It starts out really basic, looking at all the different elements that are required on a package, and then goes into excruciating detail about every aspect. So I've included a link to that industry tool here, and I'm just going to be summarizing the requirements briefly so you have a quick idea of what you're going to be looking for, and then certainly dive into that tool. They have everything from the font size and the ratios of different sizes of different elements to the different wording that can and can't be used for each different element. So to start out quickly here, the front of your package is called the principal display panel. That's the part that faces the consumer when it's sitting on the shelf. There are only two things that must be on that front display panel: the common name and the weight of your product. Those both need to be facing the consumer on your principal display panel. So the common name is not what you've chosen to call your product. So if you're developing a pancake mix and it's the best, tastiest ever, fluffiest pancakes that taste just like grandma's, you can write that on the front. But in addition to that, you need to have the common name, which would simply be pancake mix. So that common name, something that consumers can identify really easily, needs to be on the front panel of your product. And the weight as well, of course, with grams or milliliters with metric. The other elements that are here that I'm describing can be placed on different parts of the label, so whether it's on the side or the back or even on the bottom of the product. As long as they're accessible, the consumer can read it without having to open a flap or unfold something. So it needs to be readily available for them to see before opening the package. So the country of origin needs to be printed on your label, and that can be either product of Canada or made in Canada. And there's requirements for what products will meet each label depending on where all of the different ingredients come from and are manufactured. Some type of a lot code and storage instructions needs to be on your package as well. So if your product has a best before date of 3 months from now, you need to explain to people how they need to be storing it and when to use it by. If your product has a much longer expiry date, if it's fine to sit around in their pantry for years and years, you still need to have some type of a lot code that will identify to you through your traceability system what ingredients went into it and when it was manufactured to be able to aid in some type of a recall situation. And so that does need to be somewhere on the product as well. There needs to be an ingredient list, and that ingredient list also includes an allergen statement. So if you're making pancake mix and you also use milk products in your pancake mix, your list of ingredients also has to have a separate statement, including emphasizing that there are potential allergens like dairy. So some of the most common allergens, I guess, are wheat, dairy, soy, sesame, and eggs. These ones need to be declared, and there's a list of how that declaration needs to look like. The nutrition facts table as well is fairly extensive. Even if you're not working with the design software, you can also access help to design that nutrition facts table. Or again, it can be done on your own through the CFIA guide. And the little screenshot here that I've shown is just taken from that guide. And you can see it shows all the details of the font size, the line spacing, the weight of each line, the spacing between each element. And so you can certainly use that information to develop the nutrition facts table based on the nutritional analysis that you've done on your own product. The company name and your address needs to be on it, and don't overlook that. Invite customers to approach you and to contact you. If they don't feel that you are someone who's approachable, then they're more likely to go and bring the product back to the store where they bought it from if they have a problem with it. But that complicates things for you. It's better for you if the customer reaches out to you directly with any concerns or questions that they might have. And so making your company name and address is a requirement, but it's also beneficial to you to have the customers coming to you directly with any concerns they might have. If your product is organic or there's a certain percentage of organic ingredients, you need the right statement explaining what that organic content is and describing who your certifying body is. The label also needs to be submitted to your organic certifier so they can approve it before it's printed. And so they will want to have the statement certified organic by your certifying agency. And that would be somewhere on the package as well. All required information on the product has to be in both French and English. You know that some food products will divide this, so one side of the product will be all in French, the other side will be all in English, or you can combine them together so that each element has a French and an English component to it. And so all of the different elements that have been listed so far need to be written in both French and English. Then there's some other optional elements that can be included on your label. So things like your brand name, a logo that you've developed for your farm or your brand, websites, QR codes, recipes, other company information, the wording that you give that helps to describe to consumers who you are as a farm and what your product is like. But be really careful with this wording. Sometimes it's not entirely intuitive what can and can't be said. Things like really great source of some type of nutrient or energy. The words great and good and all these words are really well defined and categorized as far as what it can and can't be said. So submit your label to approval to CFIA, and they will be able to catch any types of problems that are with the wording, anything extra that you write about your product. Do be careful about what you say there. And then the final element is a UPC code. And so the UPC code is just the barcode that gets scanned in at retail locations. It's not required by CFIA to have a UPC code on it, but it will be the requirement of most retailers. Some small shops might just sticker label your product, but most retailers will be scanning it into a UPC, scanning it in with the barcode. And so those UPC codes are codes that you buy and you own that one number. And that one number can be assigned to one product and one product only. If you make any changes, if you change the size or you change any of the ingredients in your product, you need to purchase a new UPC code because each UPC code describes only one individual product. You can purchase your UPC codes from GS1 Canada, and then you pay for the code, and then you also pay an annual subscription fee. Another option that can get fairly expensive, another option is to purchase your UPC codes from a GS1 reseller. And so these are companies who buy hundreds of thousands of UPC codes. They're paying the annual license fee, and they simply sell you each number individually. And because they're buying in bulk and then selling them to you, it can be very, very economical, $10 or $20 per number as a one-time fee rather than a several $100s every year that you would pay to GS1. And retailers are, I think there's, as far as I've heard, the only retailer that requires you to have a UPC code directly from GS1 would be, I believe, Walmart for their online sales. And so every other retailer that I've ever come across is fine with using UPC codes from resellers. So that's a quick look at some of the different elements that you need to be looking at for your label. One aspect of your processing and your product flow that can be easy to overlook is the byproduct that you might be generating. If you're cleaning your own grain, you'll certainly be generating screenings, which is off-grade product, weed, seeds, chaff, dust, straw, etc., and also a good portion of perfectly good product that ends up as collateral damage. If you're doing further processing to your grain, you will likely generate some kind of byproduct as well. It's important to consider these byproducts really carefully early on in your planning, as those byproducts can influence the direction of your product and your net profitability. You may find that reducing or finding an alternative use for your byproducts is a market opportunity in and of itself, and it may present an opportunity to recover some value. Or on the flip side, it may present really real hurdles in finding ways to dispose of that byproduct. Looking at waste stream, the National Zero Waste Council of Canada has a food loss and waste strategy. I've included that in the links in the notes section. And that strategy outlines the most and least desirable ways to address food waste. So they have 4 different categories here. The first is to prevent and reduce. So this is minimizing the amount of byproduct or screenings that you have, preventing it entirely in some cases if you're able to rerun product and prevent as much good product as possible from entering the waste stream. The second level is to be able to recover this for use for people. So being able to integrate this into other food products, whether it's your own products or finding some other company with similar products that might be able to use your off-grade or different grade screenings. And then the next step is to recover for livestock, to be able to integrate this into animal feed. And then finally, to be able to compost the byproduct or to be using it as an energy source. So this would be pelletizing and using for a fuel source. And then very last is just disposal. And so finding some way to just get rid of that product. Following this strategy, with first preventing and reducing and disposal as the very last option, will certainly help your farm to be the most ecologically sustainable and also maximizing your profit. Generally, if you're reducing your screenings, you're maximizing the amount of product that you're able to sell and generate the maximum profit from. Selling it for human consumption is going to be generally more profitable than selling it for livestock, which will be more profitable than using it for compost or energy, and certainly more profitable than disposal, which will likely come with costs. For screenings, if you're doing grain cleaning, you can certainly sell screenings in bulk quantities to livestock producers, or you can try value adding to those screenings by blending or formulating them with other products for specific needs, for backyard chickens or for bird seed or any of number of different areas that they could be used for different livestock. If you're in the organic sector, you may find that organic feed has high value to small scale and hobby farmers, and it may be valued in commercial quantities, but this will be dependent on the volume that you generate and your proximity to organic livestock. In Manitoba, our organic livestock industry is probably underdeveloped, and so there's not very many places where large quantities of screenings would be able to be used and valued at an organic rate. But certainly there's a lot of individuals and backyard hobby scale farmers who greatly value knowing that what they're feeding their animals is chemical free. Some byproducts may not have any monetary value, but you may find other producers who can use them anyways, for compost or for growing mediums. So this would be dust or chaff or hulls. Finding ways to avoid these from entering the waste stream is also beneficial. And you may find that there's funding available for sustainable systems and waste stream reduction. So there was a food waste reduction challenge with funding opportunities. Unfortunately, this ended in 2021. But if you take a look at some of the different funding opportunities under the Sustainability CAP program, there is possibilities of funding available for developing processes that can help to reduce your waste stream. Another topic for consideration is how you're going to be getting your product to the retail stores or to the restaurants that will be using it. There's two different options here, and neither one is better than the other. You can be delivering product yourself, so in-house distribution, or you can work with a distribution company that will hold your product in their warehouse, wait for orders from a retail location, sometimes solicit orders, and then deliver it to the individual locations, and then do the invoicing and paperwork around the deliveries itself. Those distribution companies may work within a certain urban center. They may work with only certain retail stores or certain chains, but they can also potentially distribute product around the province or even a cluster of provinces. So it can be a way of certainly extending your geographic reach. It can certainly feel like working with a distributor is making it big in the food world, but this isn't necessarily the case. Some of the biggest food brands, the Pepsi of the world, continue to do their own distribution. And there are some advantages that doing in-house distribution can offer you and your product. Bringing the product to the store yourself certainly gives you the most influence over product placement. You can be there advocating to get your product better shelf space. If you see an opening on the shelf at eye height when your product's currently at floor level, you can be asking store managers if they might be able to make space for your product in a better spot. It's much more likely that you'll end up having your product kind of featured on some of the end displays, or you're just getting better facing for your product. It can certainly be possible when you're there advocating because you're the one who cares about your product the most. However, there are certainly logistic challenges in making frequent and regular deliveries. This might depend on your proximity, how far away it is to your urban center, how many different urban centers you're spread out between, how far is it that you're delivering your product to, and your own schedule. How thin can you spread yourself? And do you have demands on the farm side of things that would make it impossible to make deliveries on a certain schedule? You can certainly try to make it to each individual location on a set schedule, whether this is monthly or weekly or every second month, depending on the product and your sales volume. And according to that schedule, go to the store, check the stock, and suggest bringing in more product if they're running low on the shelf. Or it is also possible just to wait for the store to order, but you're at the behest of the shelf stockers and the store managers to notice your product and notice when it's running low. And often there will be a gap on the shelf because they'll wait till it's actually entirely empty before they reach out to actually place an order. And so whether you're delivering on a schedule or are waiting for orders, both are demanding. Both take a lot of time and energy. Another factor is that some stores may prefer not to work with individual companies. They know that that you're going to be there in your face, asking for favors, looking for that better placement, and it's just a hassle for them to be dealing with 50 different individual companies rather than one distribution company who will work with the logistics of all those different companies for them. So some stores will not take your product unless you're working with a distributor. So working with a third-party distribution certainly can extend your geographic reach. And if that distributor is doing a great job, they're making friends with the store manager, they're advocating for your product, and they're using the relationships that they've already built with different stores, with different restaurants to suggest your product to the store. And that can be another layer where you're just expanding your team. You've got now a distribution company that's working for you, and they have sales reps and they have their delivery drivers, and all of those people are helping to bring your product to the best placement in the store. But keep in mind that they also have hundreds of products that they're doing that for. And so do they have similar products to you? Do they have, what are their incentives to promote your product more than others? So that's certainly not an easy question to answer. And then, of course, there's the profitability as well. So a distribution company will likely take 20 to 30% margin. So if you're selling to a retail store for rough numbers, we'll talk about numbers more a little bit later. But if you're selling directly to a retail store for your product is selling for, you're selling it to $5. If you're selling it to a distributor, you'll be selling to the distributor for about $4. They'll be taking the extra dollar and then selling it to the retail store for $5. So what is your scale? What's your how much lower of a price can you afford to offer? And what's the volume of product that you bring to each store? If you're bringing a store hundreds of dollars of product, or if you bring them just a few, a case or two at a time, that may also influence whether or not it makes sense to be working with another distributor or doing that service on your own. So you may have dove into on-farm processing in part because you had excess labor capacity, a partner or a family member who wanted to be able to leave their off-farm job and join the farm. But somewhere along the way, or maybe right from the start, you're likely going to need to be hiring to accomplish some of the jobs involved with the processing of your product. This can be a really good time to assess your own strengths and weaknesses, to evaluate where your business is excelling and where there's opportunity for improvement. Bringing on a new employee is building a team, so it's important to take time to reflect on where you're at. Some of the different jobs that you may consider hiring for, I've divided into a few different categories. So you may be able to hire someone to really take ownership over one particular area. So the first category would be those jobs that are maybe more mechanical in their focus, maintaining, calibrating machinery, troubleshooting repairs, keeping the infrastructure in best condition. The next general topic would be communication. This would be the tasks involved with marketing, website and social media, emails with customers, perhaps a salesperson doing demos, trade shows, or farmers markets. Organizational would be another category. This would involve the traceability requirements, your food safety program, invoicing and accounting. The production side of things, running the equipment, packaging, shipping and receiving, and finally distribution, which may not be on site at all. This might be a delivery driver doing some deliveries. Now, hiring in a rural agricultural area is not always easy. The pool to draw from might be fairly limited. You might love standing in farmers markets more than anything else, but the only person available to hire might be the teenager down the road, and that might be a better fit for them to be doing those demos or farmers markets than it is for them to be welding and fixing some of your equipment. So in ideal world, you would hire for the jobs that you would like to outsource. In small towns, that situation may be different. I remember having a job posted for 3 months once before there was a single applicant. A consideration might be contract work for specific tasks. Hiring a contractor to do particular jobs certainly increases your management role in overseeing each task. No one ever has full control over one area, except for you. But this also gives you greatest control and oversight. When you're looking at the labor pool, family members and youth are likely going to come into the picture. There's certainly benefits of working with family members, but the drawback is certainly complicated dynamics when or if things go badly. To balance the idealism of the picture-perfect farm family, we've all heard horror stories of families torn apart by business relations gone sour. So this is one to give careful thought to. If you're hiring a family member, are you willing to potentially take some hits in that aspect of your business to maintain good family relationships? Or are you willing to sacrifice that relationship to ensure that the business is successful? These are not easy questions to answer. Consider as well the recruitment platforms that you're using. Match those recruitment platforms to the type of employment you're offering. If you're looking for someone to work on production, certainly something targeted to the geographic area that you're in. The job ad hung up in the post office or the town cafe might be the best way to find someone, and may get more traction than a more professional looking job ad on a recruitment website. Looking to some post-secondary institutions for agricultural workers or food processing might be a good fit. Social media and posters in town might be the best way to find someone for work that's specifically targeted to your on-site location. For some of the other jobs with communications and marketing, you may be able to hire outside of your community to someone who has more targeted skills. Consider as well, there may be federal or provincial grants and hiring incentives. These are often available for summer students, students hired for work during the summer months. Sometimes there are also grants and incentives specifically for agricultural workers, or to hire those who are facing employment barriers, or for specific fields and for specific skilled workers. Consider as well what you offer as an employer that's different from other workplaces. If you're a small employer with just a few employees, you may be able to offer flexibility that's not available in other workplaces. You might be able to offer some form of investment in the business, a work location that's targeted to the person's needs, maybe a variety of tasks or skill trainings that the employee will benefit. So consider what it is that you're offering that will be able to attract the best workers. One further consideration is with seasonal balance. Bringing in seasonal labor might be a consideration, but most food processing tasks will likely be more consistent throughout the year than farm work. So you may find that your on-farm processing actually balances out your workload so that you no longer have seasonal peaks and valleys. This can be a real benefit, but there's also some challenges that I'm going to expand on with the next slide. So if you've structured your business with some degree of fluidity between your farm and your processing, you may find yourself in a fuzzy middle ground between agricultural and manufacturing environments. So it's important to understand the distinction between them in our labor code. Details are set by provincial legislation, and so it varies from province to province. The information that I've synthesized here is an example, but it's not true to one specific province. And there is some information that would be from each of the prairie provinces. So I've included links in the resource page to some of the specific requirements for each province, but it's important to be aware that some of these may impact your hiring practices. So the first category then would be farm employees. And so these are people working in outdoor farm tasks. And for those types of employees, there's no restrictions on overtime, and holiday pay is not required. For another category would be family members who are employees of the farm. And in some provinces, there's no standards for minimum wage to be followed. And there's an exemption to the restrictions around employing youth. So generally, if you're hiring a youth, there's certain jobs that can and cannot be done by those youth. And there's hours that they can and can't work, and restrictions on how many hours in a day. And those may not apply if it's a family member who is also a farm employee. And in one of the provinces as well, even farm employees who aren't part of the family don't have those same restrictions around employing youth. So I do recall hiring a youth for a summer student at one point, and talking to the province about what jobs could be performed and which ones couldn't. And it was very clear that that youth would not be allowed to walk into our processing facility. They could package product because that was away from the machinery. But at the end of the week, when all of the machinery was turned off and we were finished processing for the week, I thought it would be a really great job to be able to vacuum up all the out dust at the end of the week. That was 100% off limits. That job could not be assigned to a youth to do because it was working around equipment, even if the equipment was turned off. However, that youth could be hired to operate a riding lawnmower as long as they had hearing protection and sunscreen. There's no question in my mind which job was less dangerous, but the definitions in our labor code around hiring youth and the difference between manufacturing and farm environments is not always intuitive. It's certainly best to be deferring to the highest safety standard, especially when safety is involved, but it's also important to know what the regulations are around those. And then so the third category here is farm employees who are working in climate-controlled facilities or in food production, and that's the wording that's pulled from the Manitoba legislation, but there is some similar category for the other provinces as well. And in those situations, all provincial labor standards apply. Now, if you're hiring someone to do farm work in some seasons and production work in others, again, you'll be in a fuzzy middle ground. According to the Manitoba Labor Code, if all or substantially all of the employees' work is in a climate-controlled facility, then they're considered a production worker and all provincial labor standards apply. However, it's an employee who works on a mixed farm where part of the duties may occur in climate-controlled facilities and other tasks are outside, then the employee is considered a farm employee and is excluded from the overtime and general holiday requirements. So this is some important differentiations to look into and to know what the categories are that you're hiring someone to do. So when you're bringing on a new employee, a topic that should be front of mind is the safety considerations on your worksite. To put it blunt, farms and manufacturing environments pose some pretty significant risks. And all employees, regardless of age or the industry that they're working in, have the right to a safe work environment. They have the right to be provided with training information on how to perform their job safely and to any personal protective equipment that they might need to be able to perform those jobs. And of course, refusing unsafe work is included in all labor codes, regardless of the industry. So in grain milling or food manufacturing, some of the most common hazards might be operating equipment, specifically what guards are in place, what the safety shutoffs are, what the electrical is for each of the pieces of equipment, working at heights if some of the equipment or your augers are elevated. Working alone can also pose some additional hazards as well. Heavy lifting will certainly be one of the considerations, so with moving things around the facility or with deliveries and distribution. And noise as well, whether or not, if you can conduct a test to ensure that the noise level is below a certain limit, or whether hearing protection should be worn in the facility. And then grain dust as well, which can be a significant lung irritant. So whether or not additional ventilation or masks should be provided, or if there's other ways to reduce the workplace hazards associated with grain dust. So depending on the size of your operation, you may also be required to have written health and safety procedures and then written documentation of the training that you're providing. The specific requirements for this vary from province to province. In some cases, the requirement is only in place if there's 5 or more employees. And so the number and the specifics might change. And so I've included links to some of the regulations for each of the prairie provinces around the safe work procedures and their development. So a safe work procedure then would be written for each task, for each piece of equipment, or for each tool that the worker is being asked to perform or to use. So that safe work procedure would include potential hazards, any personal protective equipment that they're required to wear, and any other safety considerations along with the steps of how to perform that task safely. And so again, depending on the number of individuals in the workplace, that would be a written procedure and then documenting the training for that. There may also be safe work certification that may be either that you could attain or that you may be required to attain, again, depending on the size of your operation. First aid training may also be a consideration, whether you're enabling your employees to access training specifically to the specific hazards or just kind of a general first aid training. There should be equipment provided for first aid equipment and also things in place to be able to report any type of workplace injuries. So it would just be the documentation and information to your employees about how to document some type of injury. Again, regardless of the requirements, this is an important area to consider before it becomes necessary. It would be extremely beneficial to establish these procedures and the training as early as possible, both as a stepping stone to be able to grow and also just to be able to have the confidence that you're providing a safe workplace to be able to avoid injuries or any health concerns arising from the work environment that you're asking people to be working in. Next up, we'll take a bit of a deeper dive into the financial side of things, and we'll look at calculating your costs and your sell prices, and then some big picture financials as well as you look at your own goals for profitability and business growth. So first up is COGS, or the cost of goods sold. These are the inevitable inputs that go into each product sold. These are the most easily calculated expenses, and they're represented tangibly with each product that you produce. So this starts with your grain or any other type of food inputs. So this would be grain that you grow on your own farm and any other grain or inputs that you're purchasing from any other food suppliers. This does get a little bit complicated when you're growing your own grain. You may want to include some of your fieldwork expenses in this category. This would be the labor associated with growing or harvesting, but it can get messy. What about the costs of growing a cover crop that will impact your soil's fertility? What if you grow 50 acres of crop, but you only sell 30 of it, and the other 20 acres is sold into the conventional grain market? What about growing a crop that doesn't meet your quality specs? There could be a case made for including all of these different expenses into your costs of goods sold, because you need to incur each of those expenses in order to have a product to produce. Or you could shuffle it into your general expense category. Certainly, keeping your farm operation separate from your food operation, from your food processing operation, will simplify your accounting, and then your cost would simply be a dollar value per pound of product purchased. But again, this is a decision to be made with a number of factors in place, whether you're separating or dividing up your farm and your food processing operations. But simplicity of accounting certainly lies with separating the two endeavors. Some of the other COGS that would be involved would be your packaging costs. So this is the cost of each retail package, the labels that might go on those packages, boxes that you use to put the product packaging into your secondary packaging, pallets that you may use to carry your boxes, shrink wrap, tape for closing your boxes, the direct tangible costs that go into actually packaging your product. Labor as well. This would be your labor costs for milling and packaging and distribution, but don't include general management costs for keeping your business going. Your COGS are simply the direct costs that you need for producing one individual product. So shipping and delivery costs would also be included in this. The cost of getting your product to the market, to your retailers or to your distributor. And then would also include lost product, slippage, so product that gets damaged before it's sold, or samples that are given out. And so those would also be included in the COGS. So these costs will fluctuate with the scale of your production. If you double your sales, these costs will also double. But they can also fluctuate within that with the cost of your inputs. As the cost of your grain or your packaging material changes over time. Hopefully these changes won't be too common and too drastic, and you'll be able to kind of put your finger on, here are my direct costs with each individual product. For example, packaging material or grain will likely increase in cost over time, but as you achieve larger sales volume, you may actually be able to reduce these costs by purchasing in larger quantities. But regardless of whether your costs are going up or down or relatively stable, at each moment in time, you should be able to come up with a very precise number that represents the direct costs of each unit that you manufacture. And that would be your cost of goods sold. And then in addition to that, we'll start layering on some of your more general expenses that we'll talk about in the next slide. So the next topic then for your financial reviews is looking at your overhead or your general expenses. So these are the expenses that will not fluctuate very much with your scale. Whether you produce a single pound or a semi-load of product every day, you'll still need to cover these costs. Sometimes these costs will increase as your sales decrease, and sometimes you'll spend less time advertising and promoting your product as your sales are increasing. So this one can be a tricky one to calculate, but just knowing what categories fit into these overhead expenses is what we're going to look at first. So first up, this would just be the supplies needed for cleaning and maintaining your equipment and facility. The maintenance costs of keeping your equipment and your infrastructure operational. This might be weekly or monthly or annual costs of all of your maintaining. Next up, insurance. This would be in addition to your farm policy, and I'll expand on it for just a moment. So you'll need a commercial policy for your food processing endeavor. So this would be a policy that's provided to you. It would usually be based on your gross income, your sales, and also the replacement value of your equipment inventory, because of course the commercial policy will protect you in case of some type of loss. You'll also be required to carry liability insurance that would protect you in the case of unsafe or contaminated product or a recall situation. This is fairly important. Retailers and some large customers may require that their names be listed on your policy. So if there is some type of, you're putting out some unsafe product, that they are leaning on your liability insurance. And so they may quantify the amount of liability insurance required. Often 1 or 2 million liability would be a common request from some of the retailers. So it's necessary for you to have that in place. Some other of the overhead expenses would be your regulatory costs. So this might be your organic certification, any type of third-party audits for food safety or for allergens, might be your HACCP, and also membership fees if you're part of any other associations. Travel and vehicle expenses, not related directly to the delivery and distribution of your product, but more generally for running your business, for picking up supplies or doing your own promotion. The next category on advertising and promotion, so printing material or developing marketing videos. These would be in your promotion costs, which is part of your overhead. And then bottom corner, depreciation of your assets. So your capital costs, of course, actually purchasing the equipment that you're using doesn't get included in your expenses. You're not writing off the entire purchase cost in your first year of operation, but every year you're accounting for a certain percentage of that asset. So the depreciation may be set at as low as 2% or as high as 20% for different assets, depending on your equipment and what you're using. So it'd be just that depreciation that's included in your overhead category. Unless you have a loan for some of that equipment, then the interest on that loan would also be included in your expense category, and any banking and professional fees. And then just the rent that you might be paying for the space that you're using, or utilities to keep the lights on, to keep operating. And so then next up, we're going to be looking at how to smash the overhead expenses together with your cost of goods sold to figure out how to price your product and get it onto the retail shelf at a price that might be possible for consumers to pick up and purchase. The gap between commodity pricing and shelf pricing in the grocery store can seem extreme. As a farmer, walking down the aisle of a grocery store can absolutely boggle your mind when you know the commodity prices that you sell your crop for. So this is intended just as a quick exercise to get some ballpark ideas, not detailed enough to land at a precise number for your own forecasting, but some type of rough guideline. There is a really thorough and valuable webinar from Manitoba Agriculture that dives into the nuances of setting your pricing for a food product. And I've included the link to that webinar on the notes page. But that's an hour-long webinar just on its own. So forewarned, this is a bit of a summary and a bit of a blunt hammer as a tool to do a similar job. But as a preliminary exercise, you can start with the cost of your grain inputs. And so if you are looking at the commodity price for a bushel of wheat, let's say $15 a bushel might be a good historic average or to use. So we're starting at a price of 27 cents a pound. Again, we had talked earlier about if you are selling your own product to yourself, if you've set up two different businesses and your farm sells to your processing, this might be an easier way to go about it than if you've got the two industries combined and you're looking at your labor costs of disking up your field a year before planting your crop. So starting with just a market average for your crop is probably a good way to start. Hopefully you're not stealing from your farming operation to be able to offset your processing. So then next you want to add some processing losses for screenings and byproduct. Again, this will vary drastically crop to crop. Industry standards can range from 20% all the way up to 75% or more losses. So for this brief exercise, we're going to kind of assume that around 50% might be unmarketable product, or a portion of the wheat that's screened out after you've milled it into flour. And so that's landing us around 54 cents a pound now. But now we have a nice flour product that's usable, that consumers will be able to use to make their bread. But now we've got to add a few more of our costs of goods sold. So the labor for packaging and for running your equipment, the cost of the packaging itself, and your transportation costs. which may vary depending on your distribution method, and we'll get back to that a little bit later. So for labor, I've just added 30 cents a package for the actual packaging labor. The cost of the packages could vary between 20 cents and $1.20, so we'll go with a middle average of about 80 cents a package. And transportation costs, I've given ourselves 10 cents a package, although depending on the distance to your market and how much you're transporting at a time and what your sales volume are, of course, these will change as well. So now we're sitting at $1.74 for our 27 cents a pound wheat flour. Now it gets even fuzzier. We start to add margin for your overhead expenses. So some people will just settle with a percentage, just go with 10% of my cost of goods sold. We're going to add it as a margin. Going for your projected sales volume is another way to do this as well. If you're anticipating that you're going to be selling 2,000 bushels of wheat, and you've calculated your overhead expenses and you think you can probably run on a budget of 45,000, that's giving you an extra 41 cents per pound that you're going to be adding to for your overhead expenses. Now you might want to add something as well for a profit margin, because you want to make something for your own labor and for the risk of starting up your own business as well. So 10% might be a good place to start, but nobody can answer that question for you as well. That's a bit of voodoo science. But now you finally have a product that you're ready to take to the retailer. Two different ways of getting to that retailer, of course, and one is through a distributor or to yourself. Kind of industry standard would be to multiply your number by 1.35 if you're selling directly to a store, in order to determine what the store will be selling that product for. If you're selling to a distributor who's then bringing it to a store, multiply your sell number by 1.7. But I would actually recommend multiplying by 1.7 anyways. It can be really difficult to analyze some of your own costs, especially some of the fuzzier costs with marketing or invoicing, the transportation involved in distribution. It's really easy to not pay yourself for the jobs that you're going to do and say, oh, I could just do that. It doesn't take that much more to bring product to the store themselves. But consider that your distributors are also doing a job and paying themselves for it. If the distributors are taking long and elaborate vacations, maybe you want their job too. But most likely their margins are pretty close to what it costs them to do the work of distribution. And so that lands you at then the sell price to consumers. So this is a good spot to stop and take and kind of analyze where you're at. Compare with similar products on the market. Is your evaluation of your flour similar to other products on the market? Is there opportunities to change the sizing of your product? Of course, selling by the pound is probably one of the least efficient ways to sell it. So you sell in a larger volume to be able to bring those costs down. If there's a huge gap, if the other products on the market are selling for a price much, much higher than what you've calculated that you think you would be able to bring your product to the market for, this might be a fantastic opportunity for you. But keep in mind that there may be hidden costs that you haven't yet thought of. If there is a really large gap, it might be tempting to jump on board and dive in, but also consider that it's also a good time to go back to the drawing board and do your numbers very closely, certainly in much more detail than a quick exercise like this, looking more thoroughly at some of your costs of the product costs and your overhead expenses, and making sure that you've given yourself the margin that you need to be able to make sure that you can be profitable in the product that you're going to be bringing to consumers. One of the most tangible ways to assess the health of your business is with regular financial reviews. Once again, being a farmer and not an accountant, I'm not going to give in-depth tools here, just an overview of how to frame some of those tools to use them for your own farm operation. Your income statement, or your profit and loss statement, shows the profitability of your business over a set time period, often in a year or a quarter. This is your income measured against your costs of goods sold and your overhead expenses. This is invaluable in your day-to-day operations and evaluating your profitability. But it leaves out some of the bigger picture questions that are only contained in the balance sheet. The balance sheet will show the investments that you've made, the equipment and the land that you purchased, balanced against your liabilities, the money that you owe, and against your profits. When you look at your income statements, some questions that may be valuable to ask yourself are your costs of goods stable? Or do you need to be modifying your pricing in order to stay profitable? Is your profitability on a per item sold basis improving as you grow? It would be good to see your overhead expenses decreasing on a per unit sold basis, but maybe business growth is running away on itself. Look at sales reports as well, and you can usually break this down to individual products or even different sizes of those products, maybe to the customers that you're selling them to or the sales channels. Are your farmers market sales or your restaurant sales where you should be focusing your energy for future expansion? Income statements from smaller periods of time can also help to determine the cause of some cash flow difficulties. Rather than looking at a full year statement, looking at a few months or one season. This can help you to identify inventory fluctuations or sales patterns that may play a role in cash flow concerns. But then turning to your balance statement, looking at your capital costs, your infrastructure, your equipment and your land, and comparing that with your profit. This can be evaluated with a few different metrics. There's the debt ratio or the return on investment calculators. In farming, return on investment can be as low as 2 or 4% annually. But the main investment, land, is often a solid enough asset that you don't necessarily need to see a return on that investment as long as that land can be sold eventually or maintain its value over the long term. With your processing equipment, are your capital assets holding their value? Is there a way that you can assess whether or not that's something that's liquid that you could be maintaining your value for? Are there also year-over-year trends that can help you to predict where your business is going or where it should be heading? In my own farm journey, we went through a period of time when we were trying to expand our product geographically. We made inroads with distribution networks, retailers, and food service operations across Western Canada, and we started working towards selling our product outside of our home province. But as we got there, things weren't really sitting right. There was this feeling that our product couldn't compete with national brands on efficiency and price point, and we hadn't really set up our company, even our infrastructure and our equipment, in a way that made sense to get to those efficiency levels. Remember the step in our packaging room. And when we were successful at gaining sales, it wasn't sitting right, even though things were looking better on our income statement. We ended up scaling back and returning to our original goals of keeping our products close to home. We knew that we needed to increase our sales. We weren't ignoring our financial statements entirely. We had expensive equipment and a mill that was only running a few days a week, and we were certainly struggling to pay our expenses. But when we spent more time considering our overarching and our non-financial goals, we decided to branch into a few new products, expanding from oats into a few other crops that we could process on the same equipment, using the setup that we already had, and that enabled us to increase our sales while staying closer to home. We also dug into some collaborative direct marketing concepts that enabled us to expand our direct-to-consumer sales and also to build community through the food that we were producing. Looking back, I feel that choosing not to expand was one of the best decisions that we've ever made, and it also led us to be more financially viable in the long run. But reviewing our financial statements alone could never have brought us to those decisions. Financial health usually looks like financial growth, and unlimited growth might be tempting. But is there a size of operation that's the best match for you? Specifically when you're connected to a tangible entity, a farm, a piece of land that has a specific time and place. Is there a point where you can be satisfied with your sales volumes and your profitability? Do you want to be selling product from a certain number of acres? Or do you have a profit benchmark to reach to sustain you and your family? Is one of your goals providing employment for a certain number of people? Do you want to be seeing your crops staying in your community and enjoyed by the people around you? Do you have specific goals around sustainability and ecology? In a globalized world, there's no limit to expansion, and with a grain processing entity, you certainly could be selling cargo loads of product across the country and internationally. But what are your own specific targets? Limitless growth will possibly have collateral damage, and one of those collaterals might be the farm that originally led you into your food processing journey. So achieving stability may be more desirable than achieving growth. It's important to step back every once in a while. Financial data certainly should be a big part of that reflection. Evaluating where you're going and why is essential to operating a business that's successful for you and not just for your bank account. And so I think that brings us to the end of the second module on operations, infrastructure, and human resources. I do hope that you'll join us again for the third module, where we will dive into marketing your grain products. See you soon.